Hello, class. I'm sorry, I got myself a little confused when I finished with the chapter 42 video part 2. Um, I said I would see you in the next part, which is part 3, which is what I'm recording right now. And so in part 3, we are going to take a little more specific a look at insider trading. Um, we're going to see what we're building on from SEC versus Texas Gulf. All right. And what I think is clear is you're going to see an expansion of the prosecutions. All right. The prosecutions started in the late 60s with prosecuting total insiders, corporate insiders. All right. Traditionally, it would be officers and directors who were held liable for trading and profiting from the use of inside information, which is information not generally available to the public. However, what we're going to be taking a look at in this part 3 is how case law has expanded liability to other people. It covers now, or insider trading covers now persons who have access to or receive non-public information, make a trade on that, and then are held liable. Right? The two theories that have been accepted at court and used to prosecute insider trading are as follows. They are 1, the tipper-tippee theory, and 2, misappropriation. If the SEC is able to make either of these theories out, they go after the investor and will charge them with insider trading. All right, so we're going to go through each of these theories, and I'd like to also introduce you to some of the case law that goes along with each of these theories. So the first theory is tipper-tippee. All right, so who are these parties, the tipper and the tippee? All right, you need a corporate insider. The corporate insider is the tipper. So think officer, corporate director. All right, you'll need a tippee, who is a person outside the corporation. All right, this tippee receives the inside information from the tipper. All right, now for liability, there's a 3-part test. And the 3-part test is laid out as follows. Number 1, the tipper breaches his or her duty by disclosing the information. Number 2, the tipper receives some personal benefit in exchange for the tip. All right, so the insider receives some kind of benefit. And we're not only looking at financial benefit. We could just be looking at some people. The tipper knows the tippee. They could be related. They could be really good friends. And the tipper likes the idea of helping their relative or friend out by sharing information. All right. They draw a personal benefit, emotional benefit from that sharing that goes on. All right. All right. The third point of the test is the tippee knows or should know of the breach by the tipper and benefits financially. Right? So those are the 3 elements you're looking for whenever you're building a case for tipper tippee. All right. And let me see if I can get this up. All right. Want to give you an example. This one comes out of your book. The name of the case is Amateur Golfers. It's fairly recent. Notice the year it was decided is 2014. All right, and here's what happened. We have Mr. McPhail, who is friends with an executive at a company called American Superconductor. All right. The 2 men golfed together, and the executive shared some information expecting McPhail to keep it confidential. All right. MacPhail, however, he shared the information with his other golfing buddies. MacPhail and all his buddies, they traded and they made money off of shares in American Superconductor. SEC caught up with them, prosecuted them, and they were found liable. Maybe not, they settled. They actually settled the case after the SEC initiated the prosecution. All right? But this is an example of what we're trying to look at here. Tipper-tippee theory applied to a trade made by people outside the company, MacPhail and his friends. All right. The second theory is misappropriation theory. Now, misappropriation, you probably can surmise, you know what that means, right? Misappropriation is taking something that does not belong to you, all right? So misappropriating it. So a person who wrongfully obtains inside information, basically we're looking at someone who might have, quote, stolen, okay, the information, all right? And they take it, trade on that information, make money off of it. The SEC will prosecute under this theory, misappropriation. All right, so there's no tipper sharing information. The person from the outside just takes it without permission. All right? We have 3 examples on the next couple of slides. Keep these in mind as you're thinking about this theory. This is from a previous edition of your book. I know for sure. I do not believe it's in your book any longer. Maybe I'm mistaken though. No, I think they took all the cases out of your text, but this is a good illustration. Look at the case. The year is 2006. All right, I know that's a little old, but it does illustrate what misappropriation theory could look like. All right, so Patricia Rockledge, she is married to the CEO of a company called Cubist Pharmaceuticals. So Scott Rockledge, the CEO, he went home one day after he had learned about Cubist drugs failing their trial. All right, he told his wife about the failed clinical trial. Patricia went and told her brother, William, and he then told his friend David, right? Both of these men, William and David, sold their shares and they avoided significant losses. So it's a savings. That's still a benefit. They gained something, all right? And the SEC took a look at those transactions, looked at the how that could have happened, and they ended up suing, okay? They ended up suing Patricia, William, and David for insider trading, all right? The defense that was raised was there was no misappropriation, all right? And this is what the court determined, I guess, after a trial, that Patricia had somehow engaged in deceptive devices and tricked her husband for purposes of assisting her brother. So it was something very intentionally done. Maybe she had kind of prompted her husband, fished, quote, fished for the information. All right. And this came out at trial. All right. So that conduct was sufficient for the court to find all parties guilty of insider trading. All right. Under the theory of misappropriation. Just an illustration for you. All right. This is where it all began, though, this whole theory of misappropriation, and was first accepted by the courts. This is a case that went up in 1997. So about the time I started teaching, all right, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court accepted the theory of misappropriation in this case, U.S. versus O'Hagan, all right. So O'Hagan, he was originally convicted in the district court, and then that conviction was reversed on appeal in the 8th Circuit, and then in his 3rd hearing in front of the courts, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed it. All right. Let me give you some idea of the facts in this case. O'Hagan, oops, I thought I wrote some more on the slides, but O'Hagan, I can tell you, he is an attorney. He was an attorney with a firm that was working on a merger and acquisition deal. All right. So Mr. O'Hagan was working on one side of the deal, working for one corporation on the in the merger, and he's a smart guy. He knows who's on the other side of the transaction, the other company, and he went out and he bought stock in the other side, the corporation on the other side. All right. He made a lot of money. I want to say he made something like $4 million. All right. And so you can see how that attracted the attention of the SEC. All right. And they charged him with insider trading on this theory of misappropriation. The Supreme Court, like I was just saying, what's it called? Approved that theory and reversed the appellate court. And so this case has stood that misappropriation is a good theory upon which to bring insider trading against an outsider to the corporation. Now, the roots of this may go back to this earlier case, and I just put this up here for interest. I think it's good to see an evolution of case law, all right? So this is a case from really way back, all right? This is from 1980, all right? So we're talking 40 years this year, all right? And the defendant in this case is a Mr. Chiarella. He worked as a printer that published corporate information. So for instance, proxy statements or prospectuses. Although when they printed, they would print in blank, so there was no name of the companies for which he was publishing information. Right? Now this has changed too. The printing industry has changed, but at that point, he would see the blank copies come through his printing company, and he's a smart man. He figured out which corporations were going to be involved in a transaction. Which one was selling perhaps their business to another, that type of thing. All right. He purchased stock. He made a profit off that purchase, and the SEC caught up with him. The SEC did charge him with insider trading, but at the time, maybe they did not develop the theory of misappropriation, so that was not the theory they brought. They were probably using more of a classic traditional approach to insider trading, but they were unsuccessful in getting a conviction. Possibly, in hindsight, misappropriation would have fit here because he basically lifted the information that he's really not entitled to have possession of and made money off of it. All right. So just to give you an idea of where we have been in the law, and possibly it gives you a little clue as to where we are headed additionally. All right. And then the last slide I'd like to take a look at with you before we finish this part 3 is the idea of scienter. Scienter is required as we discuss insider trading. The defendant has to have intended the fraud or know that his actions are fraudulent in order for there to be a conviction on insider trading. All right, I'm going to close out the part 3 of chapter 42 here, and we will pick up the last section, part 4. We're going to take a look at the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 in the context of short swing profits, and we'll take a little bit of a small look at corporate governance.